December 1944. The Ardennes forest, a frigid, snow-choked expanse in Belgium. A lone German staff car, a drab grey Opel, churns through the drifts, its occupants cloaked in heavy, wool greatcoats. General Feldmarschall Walther Model, his face a mask of grim determination, glances out at the endless ranks of men, horses, and carts struggling through the snow. This was the offensive, a desperate, audacious gamble to split the Allied lines, to reverse the tide of a war that was slowly, inexorably, turning against them. But every mile gained was a brutal fight against the terrain, against the weather, and most critically, against the suffocating lack of fuel. Horses, the age-old beasts of burden, pulled artillery and supplies, their breath steaming in the biting cold. They were the backbone of Model's logistics. He knew, as did every officer in the Wehrmacht, that mobility was everything in modern warfare. Yet, for Germany, true mobility remained a fleeting dream, a stark contrast to the relentless, mechanized juggernaut they now faced in the West. He could never have imagined the scale of the logistical miracle the Americans were about to unleash, an industrial marvel that would leave commanders like him utterly stunned. The summer of 1944 was a season of breathtaking speed. After the brutal, grinding attrition of the Normandy hedgerows, the Allied war machine finally broke free. Operation Cobra had shattered the German lines, and now, armies under commanders like the famously aggressive General George S. Patton were rampaging across the French countryside. His Third Army was a blur on headquarters maps, covering dozens of miles a day, encircling entire German divisions, and liberating towns and cities in a relentless armoured flood. To the American public back home, it was a triumphant newsreel of victory. But to the Allied High Command, specifically the logisticians of the Communications Zone, or COMZ, it was a full-blown crisis. An army, especially a fully mechanized American army, does not run on courage, it runs on fuel. And Patton's tanks were insatiable. A single Sherman tank consumed a gallon of gasoline for every 2 miles it traveled. An entire armored division could burn through 80,000 gallons in a single day of aggressive movement. The problem was that the front line was moving far faster than the supply lines could ever hope to keep up. The only major port the Allies had was Cherbourg, and the Mulberry harbours on the invasion beaches were still the main points of entry. Every single gallon of gasoline, every bullet, every food ration had to be unloaded, sorted, and then trucked hundreds of miles over roads that were often damaged or congested. The initial, legendary solution to this problem was the Red Ball Express, a massive, non-stop truck convoy system operated primarily by African-American soldiers that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was an epic feat of endurance and organization, a symbol of American ingenuity. But it was also a temporary fix, a logistical band-aid on a hemorrhaging wound. The trucks themselves consumed enormous quantities of fuel just to deliver fuel. They required constant maintenance, and the drivers were pushed to the absolute limits of human exhaustion. From the other side of the hill, the German High Command watched this frantic Allied dash with a sense of grim, strategic patience. Field marshals like Gerd von Rundstedt were masters of the operational art. They had seen this exact scenario play out before, on the vast plains of Russia. An enemy makes a spectacular advance, their supply lines stretch to the breaking point, and the offensive literally runs out of gas. They never expected the Americans to solve this fundamental problem of warfare. They believed it was a law of nature. They were pulling back, yes, but they were also waiting for the inevitable moment when the American armored beast would starve, slow to a crawl, and become vulnerable to a devastating counterattack. The German commanders couldn't believe the advance was sustainable. In their minds, it was a logistical impossibility. They were waiting for a collapse that, to their utter shock, would never come. To truly understand why the German High Command was so certain the Allied advance would fail, one must look at the animal that was, shockingly, the true prime mover of the Wehrmacht, the horse. The popular image of the German military was one of panzer divisions and mechanized infantry, the blitzkrieg machine. But this was only the tip of the spear. The vast majority of the German army, even in 1944, moved at the speed of a horse's walk. Throughout the war, the Germans employed over 2.7 million horses, Hundreds of thousands were still in service on the Western Front, hauling everything from artillery pieces and ammunition wagons to field kitchens and medical supplies. For every sleek Panzer IV or Tiger tank at the front, there were thousands of horses toiling in the rear. This wasn't a strategic choice. It was a crippling industrial necessity. Germany simply could not produce enough trucks to motorize its entire army. More critically, it lacked the one resource that defined modern warfare: oil. The entire German war effort was a constant, desperate struggle against a catastrophic fuel shortage. Their own blitzkrieg into Russia in 1941 had been halted, in part, by the same logistical constraints they now expected the Allies to face. They projected their own crippling weakness onto their enemy. The idea of an army having too much mobility, of an offensive moving so fast that it outran its own fuel, was a problem they would have considered a luxury. The American army, by contrast, was a completely different species of organization. It was the most motorized and mechanized army the world had ever seen. There was no column of American artillery being pulled by horses. Every soldier was part of a system built around the internal combustion engine. This gave them incredible tactical and operational mobility, but it also made them utterly dependent on a colossal, uninterrupted flow of gasoline. The logisticians at ComZ knew the Red Ball Express, heroic as it was not the answer. They were burning almost as much fuel as they were delivering. They needed a new solution, something revolutionary. They needed an artery, a direct vessel from the ports of Normandy to the roaring engines of the front line. They were about to build something that the horse-tethered German commanders never knew was possible: the enemy's disbelief. Sometime in late August 1944, a bizarre report landed on the desk of a German intelligence officer at OB West, the German Army Command in the West. Sourced from aerial reconnaissance and fragmented prisoner interrogations, it described something utterly nonsensical: an iron snake slithering across France. It claimed the Americans were not just trucking their fuel forward, they were pumping it through a vast, rapidly constructed pipeline. The initial reaction was one of scornful disbelief. It was dismissed as either Allied propaganda designed to demoralize them or a simple misinterpretation of a waterline. German commanders, who had to meticulously plan every panzer movement based on carefully hoarded fuel delivered by vulnerable trucks and trains, simply laughed at the idea. It was absurd. Building a pipeline is a massive, static, civilian engineering project that takes years. How could a military build one through a war zone at the speed of an armoured advance? But the reports kept coming. Luftwaffe pilots, flying perilous missions against overwhelming odds, reported strange, thin lines scarring the landscape, stretching for miles, attended by crews of American engineers working in broad daylight with an arrogance that was infuriating. It was then that the disbelief began to curdle into a cold, creeping dread. They had been so focused on the front lines, on the tanks and the planes, that they had completely missed the true nature of their enemy. The Americans weren't just fielding an army, they were fielding a mobile, industrialized nation. The German High Command was shocked. The pipeline was real. This logistical miracle, which defied every principle of warfare they understood, meant the American armored divisions would never starve. They would never slow down. It was a horrifying realization. An engineering marvel. The men who made this German nightmare a reality were not frontline combat soldiers. They were the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, specifically the engineer petroleum distribution companies. They were builders, plumbers, and mechanics, and they were the unsung heroes of the Allied advance. Their weapon was not a rifle, but a length of steel pipe and a wrench. The system they deployed was a masterpiece of American pragmatism and industrial design. It wasn't one single, massive pipeline, but a network of smaller, more manageable pipes, typically 4 or 6 inches in diameter. The genius was in the speed of assembly. The pipes were light enough to be handled by a small crew, and the sections were joined together not by slow, laborious welding, but by innovative Victorlic couplings. These were simple, grooved metal collars with a rubber gasket that could be bolted tight in minutes, creating a secure, flexible seal. Powerful gasoline-driven pumping stations, mounted on trucks for mobility, were installed every 10 to 15 miles to keep the fuel flowing. A single company of these engineers could lay several miles of this pipeline in a single day. They worked in a relentless rhythm. Trucks would string the pipe along the planned route, crews would leapfrog one another to connect the sections, and the pump stations would be brought online. They followed Patton's advance so closely that they were often within range of enemy artillery. They were building a 500-mile long fuel line while it was still an active combat zone. The Germans couldn't believe it. They were witnessing a level of engineering and industrial might that they simply could not match. The scale of the operation, the sheer scale of the pipeline operation, was something German intelligence could barely quantify, let alone comprehend. This wasn't a single pipe. It was an ever-expanding, interconnected network. The main line, stretching from the port of Cherbourg, was just the beginning. From this central artery, smaller branch lines spread out like veins, feeding fuel directly to massive storage tank farms concealed in forests and fields just behind the front. From there, it was a short truck ride to the thirsty tanks and vehicles. By the time the Allies reached the German border, the engineers had laid over 1,000 miles of pipe. The system was pumping over 1 million gallons of fuel every single day. German commanders, who received frantic reports about their own precious fuel depots being bombed, were horrified by this reality. They were fighting a war of scarcity, meticulously rationing every litre of gasoline. Their Panzer divisions, the pride of the Wehrmacht, were often rendered immobile not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. Now, they faced an enemy that had effectively laid a petroleum river across an entire country. The Americans hadn't just solved their logistical problem. They had obliterated it with a display of industrial power that was simply demoralizing. It was a clear, terrifying message. You are not fighting an expeditionary force. You are fighting the full, unbridled might of American industry. The pipeline as a symbol, ultimately, the pipeline became more than just a piece of infrastructure. It became the defining symbol of this new kind of war. For the German soldier, the most terrifying weapon wasn't the P-47 Thunderbolt screaming down from the sky, or even the M4 Sherman tank cresting a hill. It was the quiet, invisible network beneath their feet. A German Tiger tank, a 57-ton beast of peerless engineering, could be defeated without a single shot being fired. All it took was an empty fuel tank. German soldiers would often find American vehicles abandoned for minor mechanical faults, their gas tanks still full, a sign of casual abundance that was unthinkable to them. The true sound of Allied victory was not the blast of a cannon, but the steady, monotonous hum of a pumping station, working day and night. That sound was a constant reminder that no matter how hard they fought, no matter how clever their tactics, a wave of steel, powered by an endless river of fuel, was coming for them. The pipeline was the weapon that guaranteed the American advance would never stop. It represented a fundamental shift in warfare, a shift the German High Command never saw coming. They had prepared for a war of maneuver and tactics, and found themselves crushed in a war of production and logistics. By September 1944, the Allied advance had reached a fever pitch. Patton's Third Army was approaching Germany's border, having covered hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. From the German perspective, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The American spearheads were now stretched to their absolute logistical limit. The distance from the front lines back to the ports at Normandy was immense. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and his staff saw this not as a defeat, but as a strategic opportunity. They were luring the Americans into a trap, a battle of annihilation where the enemy's own success would become their undoing. Their entire defensive strategy was predicated on a single, fundamental belief. Patton was about to run out of gas. It was a mathematical certainty. German intelligence had calculated the fuel consumption of American armored divisions. They knew the state of the French road and rail networks. By every doctrine of war they had ever studied, the Third Army was on the verge of sputtering to a halt. The plan was simple. Let the Americans advance to the Siegfried Line, let their supply lines collapse under their own weight, and then, once the Panzers were immobile and isolated, launch a massive counterattack with the newly formed Panzer brigades. It was to be a repeat of their great victories from the early years of the war. They were confident. They were prepared. They never expected that the rules of logistics had been completely rewritten without their knowledge. For a few tense days in early September, it seemed the German gamble might pay off. Patton's spearheads did, in fact, begin to slow. Fuel allocations were cut. Some armoured units were temporarily halted, waiting desperately for the trucks of the Red Ball Express to arrive. On the German side, a sense of grim satisfaction took hold. This was it. The moment of collapse was at hand. They began moving their reserve panzer units into position for the kill. And then, nothing happened. The American halt was just a pause. A brief, deceptive intake of breath before a renewed roar. The engineer petroleum distribution companies had done the impossible. Working around the clock, they had connected the main pipeline to massive new fuel depots just behind the front. The spigots were opened, and the lifeblood of the American army began to pour forth, not in the thousands of gallons brought by trucks, but in the millions of gallons pumped directly from the coast. The supply crisis vanished overnight, the tanks refueled, the engines roared back to life. The advance resumed with a speed and ferocity that left the German commanders utterly paralyzed. This was the true turning point. It was the moment the German High Command realized the war was truly lost. Their perfectly logical, textbook strategy, based on a century of military science, had been rendered obsolete by an engineering feat they had dismissed as fantasy. They were shocked. They had planned for a battle against an army, but they were in a war against a force that could bend the very rules of logistics to its will. The American armored columns that should have been dead in the water were now crashing against the Siegfried Line, fully fueled and fully supplied. The Germans couldn't believe it. Their trap had not only failed, it had never even existed. The failure of the Germans' defensive strategy at the Siegfried Line bled into the brutal attrition of late 1944. But the pipeline's most critical contribution was yet to come. In December, Hitler launched his last, desperate gamble in the West, the Ardennes offensive, known to the Americans as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was audacious. Elite panzer divisions would smash through the thinly held American lines, race to the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies. The entire operation, however, had a fatal flaw. It was planned by a high command that was still shackled by a mindset of scarcity. The German spearheads were given just enough fuel to get started. The plan relied entirely on capturing American fuel depots along the way. As the German tanks pushed forward, the now vast pipeline network became the backbone of the American defense. While German panzers were literally running out of fuel in the middle of the frozen forests, becoming easy targets for American fighter bombers, the Allied logistical system went into overdrive. The pipelines allowed commanders to rapidly shift fuel resources to threatened sectors. Most famously, when the 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, it was the pipeline that enabled Patton to perform a logistical miracle. He disengaged his Third Army from its offensive in the Saar, pivoted it 90 degrees, and sent it on a 100-mile race north to relieve the besieged city, an operational maneuver on a scale that would have been utterly impossible without a guaranteed, massive supply of fuel. German commanders who had been on the offensive were stunned by the speed of the American reaction. As the Allies pushed into the heart of Germany in the spring of 1945, the pipeline followed them. In one of the most audacious engineering feats of the war, American engineers laid pipelines across the bed of the Rhine River, ensuring the armored divisions plunging into the Ruhr Valley would have the fuel they needed. By the end of the war in Europe, the system had grown to thousands of miles in length, a testament to the industrial power that had been brought to bear against the Third Reich. For the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who surrendered in those final months, the reality of their defeat was not found in a treaty, but in the American supply dumps they were marched past. Starving, exhausted, and demoralized, they saw a spectacle of abundance that they couldn't believe. There were literal mountains of 5-gallon jerry cans, stacked 20 feet high, stretching for acres. There were endless rows of oil drums, warehouses overflowing with food, and vehicle parks filled with brand-new trucks and tanks. It was a cultural shock of the highest order. They saw firsthand that their enemy wasn't just well supplied. They were drowning in a level of material wealth that Germany could never have hoped to match. This overwhelming logistical superiority was the final, crushing blow to their morale. They never knew such a war of plenty was even possible. In the final accounting of the Second World War, history rightly remembers the courage of the soldiers on the front lines, the genius of the battlefield commanders, and the sacrifice of nations. But the war in Western Europe was ultimately decided not in the hedgerows or the forests, but in the factories of Detroit and the oil fields of Texas. It was a war of production, a brutal equation of industrial might, and the German High Command, brilliant as they were, brought 19th-century logistics to a 20th-century fight. The American pipeline, that simple, ugly, miles-long iron snake, was the perfect symbol of this new reality. German generals, who trusted in the superiority of their tactics and the engineering of their tanks, laughed at the idea of it. They were shocked when they realized it was real and couldn't believe the scale on which it operated. In the end, they were not outfought as much as they were overwhelmed. While they meticulously planned the movements of their fuel-starved Panzers, the United States built a river of gasoline and pumped it across a continent. The steady, quiet hum of those distant pumping stations was the true soundtrack of their defeat, a relentless, mechanical heartbeat proving that the greatest weapon of all was not a tank or a plane, but America's ability to simply build the impossible.